Hello and welcome to the Ros Savage Project podcast. This is week 11 of my class on courage and theory in practice. My name is Ros Savage and I am in New Haven in Connecticut.
And I am Vic Phillipson and I am in Kristiansand, Norway, where it is sunny, sunny, sunny today.
And it's sunny, sunny, sunny in New Haven as well.
Yes.
And sadly, when I was packing up my suitcases in January, it was very hard to imagine what hot weather felt like. So now I find that all my clothes are too warm.
So it's warm? How warm is it?
In centigrade, it was like 19 yesterday.
Holy cow. That's summer here, you know.
I was in knee-high boots. I was sweltering.
Oh my. Well, it's about 9 here today. The wind's blowing pretty good, but it's a beautiful day outside. Sun is shining, so.
Oh,
yeah.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah.
So, week 11 is all about political courage.
Oh, good.
And when I was putting the syllabus together last summer, again, I had no idea just how fascinating a subject politics would be by now.
And how courage would play into all of that political stuff.
Exactly. We were very good. We did not indulge in any politician bashing of any party or any individuals whatsoever.
No, really? That must have been
only covertly. But that doesn't mean we can't do it in the podcast.
No, I was going to say, I don't know if I can avoid that when we get there, but yeah.
Well, we started out with quite an inspiring version of politics. Unfortunately, it had to be entirely fictional. So it was a clip from The West Wing.
Oh, okay.
Of let Bartlett be Bartlett. This is more important than re-election.
Okay. I've watched all those, but it's been a long time. I haven't seen them for a long time.
I was actually surprised and delighted to find out that a couple of my students are huge fans of The West Wing.
Oh, yeah. It was a great, great program. Sadly,
yeah, although it does look a little bit cheesy in retrospect now, but but it doesn't have the cynicism of something like House of Cards.
No, House of Cards is not exactly about courage.
No.
Well, it is about, it's a misplaced courage.
Yes.
You know, when the protagonist's first act on screen is to break the neck of a dog, that's the first thing that happens in House of Cards.
Well, that would not go down at all well if he'd done that in Britain, because we probably, not me personally, but as a whole, it's known that the Brits prefer dogs to humans.
To humans, yes, I know.
Apart from the Queen, who prefers horses to dogs to humans.
Well, then how do you approach political courage without politician bashing?
Well, because we were talking about political courage rather than lack thereof. So I think that we were naturally talking about the more courageous kind of politician. So actually we looked at it from several different perspectives. One was political courage as a citizen. So we looked at a number of case studies of people who had won the Nobel Peace Prize. And these were in two broad categories, dissidents and champions. So these were civilians, if I can use that word, non-political people, but who operated either as critics of the prevailing political regime or sort of used the prevailing political regime to achieve good social ends. So that was quite inspiring, actually.
Mm-hmm. So obviously you had Nelson Mandela in that group.
We did, but it was a specific book that we were looking at that didn't cover Nelson Mandela, but Nelson Mandela did crop up quite a lot.
Sure.
Although also, of course, he started out sort of as a terrorist.
It's a fine line sometimes, isn't it?
It is, and sometimes it's only history that decides.
Yeah. And Gandhi, I'm sure, turned up in the conversation.
We didn't actually mention Gandhi. We talked about him before in... I can't remember. Well, he definitely came up in definitions of courage. He's come up a few times, of course. No, our dissidents were Andrei Sakharov and I can't remember the other names now because they were really quite difficult names to remember. Ozietsky was one of them. Anyway, you can read the blog post because they're all in there.
I see.
Um, so we looked at political courage as a citizen and political courage um, in an international organisation like the United Nations. You're rustling
I
papers.
know I'm rustling papers because the sun is shining so intensely on the bottom of my monitor. It's shining a big, shiny thing in my face. I can't hardly see the screen. Sorry.
That's okay. No, I can see you've got like a line of dots
Yeah, I know.
of
I can't. I
sunlight.
don't know if it's just pounding in here. Just a second. Let me put my thing down. Oh, go on. Talk away.
Okay.
There we go. That's
Uh,
even worse. Where is that coming from? Anyway, let's go on. Oh,
okay.
yeah.
It's tough at the top, Vic. Like the working conditions
How
that.
ironic is it that you would be disturbed by sunshine in Norway? I have no idea where that's coming from. Anyway, we do have to explain that I was a little late to the program today. Yeah.
Because
Well, I was out with the dog, and then I was cooling off. I've been in the sauna, and I took a little cooling off in my bedroom, and I thought I'd set my timer, and I hadn't. So 1 minute until I was supposed to talk to you, I was au naturel.
too much information.
Too much information.
So I should say I did not see Vic totally au naturel. He did at least have a shirt on when he first appeared on camera. And had he not mentioned the fact that he was wearing no pants, I would be blissfully unaware of the facts.
Well, I've totally derailed the topic here. Where were we?
We were moving on to the third section, which was political courage as a leader, which included the courage to go into politics and courage once in office. So actually, I think as we're a little bit limited on time today, as I have to go off to a bunch of meetings, why don't we jump straight to political courage as a leader? Because I think that's what we tend to think about the most when we think about political courage.
Mm-hmm.
I think that'd be the most fun, don't you?
Yes, right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So within that, we first of all looked at the courage to go into politics, which I found quite interesting because I did at one stage look at going into politics myself.
Mm-hmm.
This probably 2 or 3 years ago now. And I spoke to some friends of mine who are members of Parliament in the UK. And after long conversations with them, I concluded that there was absolutely no reason why I would want to go into politics.
It's a heartless, soulless game. It is
and
hard.
Thankless.
It is very thankless, yeah.
In fact, we did briefly touch on that. We looked at some of the great prime ministers who were involuntarily kicked out at the end of their careers. So Winston Churchill, who had led Britain through the Second World War, was promptly voted out as soon as
he didn't survive very long after the war, did he? It was in 46 or 48 that he was voted out. 46.
I think it was 45.
Oh, it was already, but yeah, right at the end of the war. Then I know it was very soon after the end of the war.
And he did come back again for another term later on, but I don't think he ever recaptured the glory days of the war.
No.
And Margaret Thatcher, who I have somewhat mixed feelings about, definitely as a female role model, she was very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly in retrospect, I don't particularly appreciate her legacy in terms of the very capitalist society that she promoted.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, she was pretty unceremoniously kicked out after a leadership challenge from within her own party after 11 years. So yes, and of course in America, they don't bother with leadership challenges, they just shoot them.
Occasionally, every once in a while.
Four times an American president has been shot while in office.
Well, my dad was very involved in the Republican Party when I was a kid. He flew with Goldwater Miller in '64. He was a volunteer. He was one of the press setup men for Bill Miller, who was the vice presidential candidate. And what they would when they traveled, they would fly into cities, and my dad would land 3 or 4 hours ahead of the arrival of the candidate, and they would make sure everything was in place, that this press area was set up. Now, this is back in the days when, you know, the tech setup was they would have a PA system in the back of a pickup on the main. No, really, on the main street. It was very informal. They did some formal things, but he was gone. He left right after the convention in August and came back after the ill-fated election in November, and was gone the entire time. My mother took over the operation of the business, which was, there's a big article about her in the Lincoln Star, the capital newspaper in Nebraska. Mm-hmm. How unusual it was that there was a woman running a livestock market in the middle of Nebraska while her husband was off campaigning yeah. So I spent, I grew up. It was not unusual for Carl Curtis, who was a long-serving senator from Nebraska. He was from Minden, just north of where I grew up. He'd come to the sale on Monday in Franklin and hang out with the farmers and do a kind of informal polling of his constituents. And my dad and Carl Curtis were good friends. And then Roman Haruska, who was the other senator from Nebraska, I saw all the time. And I have a really funny letter that he wrote to my mother and said what a pleasure it was that I got to come to lunch the other day. And he did notice that I had a hole in my jeans. I told him that my mom didn't want me to go because I had a hole in my jeans. Anyway, so I was around all those people and around party politics a lot. And in '66, they asked my dad to run for governor, and he should have run. They instead ran a guy named Charles Thone, who was from Camel, Nebraska, just north of where we're from. And he won in '66. I think my dad could have run but my mother did not want to be involved in that. She did. You know what?
I was thinking, I'm sort of wishing they'd asked your mother to run. Yeah. Because apparently, even now, there are only 5 female governors out of the, 50 states, mm-hmm. which is not a very impressive percentage. Yeah. And this was one of the things that we looked at yesterday was like the pretty poor rates of women going into politics.
Can you blame them? It is a terribly thankless. I think in the 60s it was not nearly as cynical, and I think people were actually. My dad and my mom both worked for Nixon in '68, and ate dinner with him a couple of times, and in Omaha. And when things got cynical was in '72 when they ran that terrible campaign where they ignored the local people because they were so far ahead they didn't have to get involved. And that was sort of the beginning of the end. My dad he never raised another dollar for the Republican Party. He never worked for them again. Ooh. He was so disillusioned by it. But in the 60s, I think there was a lot less cynicism, a lot more sort of kind of clear-eyed patriotism, I guess you could say. They were more maybe that's my memory of it. But they certainly did seem more earnest than they do now.
Although even now, when you look at the lists of most admired people in America, for both men and women, the lists are still dominated by politicians.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm even now?
Even now. Yeah. So, well, I haven't seen a result since last November. So I don't know about now, but certainly halfway through 2016, politicians were still way up there, although presumably a lot of their votes came from within their own, not within their own party, but, a Democrat is not going to be particularly admiring of Republicans and vice versa.
Well, party politics in the United States is a real sport. I mean, people fasten on to those parties as people in England do to their football teams. Yeah.
Actually, it reminds me more of WWF wrestling.
Yeah. So I think that really plays into the Americans' love of competition.
Yeah.
Americans love to compete and are competitive at all possible levels. And yeah,
Can we
so
just go back to the women in politics thing? Because as well as it being generally a thankless task, I do think it's especially thankless for women.
mhm.
When you look at the language that gets used around them in the media, and you know what happened with Hillary last year, and she has said, and I don't think it's entirely without justification, that there was a lot of misogyny involved in that.
You
But then
think?
much, yeah, and I don't think it's as bad in the UK. And I suppose one of the reasons that I didn't want to go into politics, apart from like the long meetings and having to be obedient to the party whip, was the general impression of in the UK the House of Commons as being this testosterone laden, well, almost like schoolyard kind of atmosphere.
Mhm.
It just doesn't look very edifying, and it does look very masculine, and not the good kind of masculine either.
No, no, a lot of chest beating.
Yeah.
And look at me, look at me. Yeah, and I think women open themselves up to or are more exposed to that kind of very casual misogyny, the kind of casual thoughtlessness that is a part of the culture. And when
Mm.
they put themselves in front of that, it they're just like magnets for it. I think that's the problem.
I
Yeah,
suppose, in a way, what happens in politics is a sort of microcosm of what's happening in society as a whole. It's just much more noticeable because it's so much more reported than
yeah, and I
almost
think
any other realm of human endeavour.
that we have a false impression of how far we've come in um, our how far we've grown beyond our base pasts. I think that we really haven't come that far.
I
Uh,
would agree with you. Although the good news is that apparently Trump is the best thing that's ever happened for recruitment of women into politics. There has been a major uptick in women interested in going into politics,
that's
and
good.
there are a number of organisations that are really supportive, like will help coach women in, I'm guessing, things like media training and presentation skills, and oh, for heaven's sake, probably even what wardrobe to choose, because that's something that gets noticed so much. So there's an organisation called She Should Run, which I think is trying to address this problem that women are notoriously bad at putting themselves forward for ambitious jobs. So women get to nominate their girlfriends. Like, she
Oh,
should run. But at least then there's this sort of mechanism for someone being invited to run rather than pushing themselves forward. So pragmatically, I think it probably works quite well. So it's just encouraging to see that that's happening.
it's also been a spur to a lot of other people. There are people, I listen to This Week in Virology and This Week in
Mm.
Microbiology. Anyway, there are a bunch of scientists now who are getting involved.
Mm, oh,
It,
that's interesting.
yeah,
I was listening to a TED Radio Hour podcast yesterday about speaking up, and James Hansen was one of the people that they profiled, the guy who used to work for NASA and has
mm,
been highlighting the relationship between CO2 and climate change since the early 1980s.
mm.
And he's unusual in that he has been willing as a scientist to speak up in a political realm. I think he was invited to give testimony to the House. But yeah, generally scientists have, yeah, you just don't think about scientists going into politics generally, do you?
No, not getting involved. Yeah. Yeah, well, they're a little bound because so much of what they do is government financed. So it's hard
Mm.
for them. I think there are strictures against them getting involved in some political stuff. I think they're sort of limited on some of their what they can use as opinion, or where if or they'll pull their government funding. I think that's part of the problem.
I'm sort of intrigued by why people do go into politics, because If they are intelligent and capable, they can earn a lot more money going into investment banking. So, do you think that despite all the cynicism, do you think that they do still go into it genuinely to try and make a difference for the better?
I think they go into it because it's a hell of a lot of fun. No, I really do. There is no.
Define fun.
Well, there are folks that have. I mean, because I was around all those guys. They were involved in that because it was for them a big game, and they really loved playing it.
Mm,
If you don't love that, if you don't love the sparring that goes on and the maneuvering and the strategy that goes on, I don't think that you would find it much fun. But there are people that just love to do that.
so those are the natural politicians in the broader sense of
The
the politicking
the,
word.
the really good. I think the people that thrive in that business are people that are sort of naturals. Bill Clinton pops to mind. You know, he's a
Yes.
natural politician. Oh, Barack Obama is a natural politician. Yeah, Ronald Reagan was a natural politician.
No offence intended.
Why?
Well, just because often, there are so many snide comments about politicians
Oh,
and obviously so many, satirical jokes at their expense.
no, I think that there are some people who are just built to do that and really enjoy it. And that was always my impression of those people, was that they were in it because they loved to do it. Now, if it was because they loved the power that went with it, that I never had the impression. And Carl Curtis and Roman Horuscu, who I knew fairly well, were both long-serving senators with a lot of power. And that never was my opinion of them.
So, where does the greater social good come into all of this?
Oh boy, I don't know. Look what it did to people like LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Who was the master of the Senate. Actually, this is one of the books that's written about him is called Master of the Senate. Um, he started. He was fairly craven in the beginning. He was from a very poor East Texas background, and as he worked his way through the system, he changed from being a Southern segregationist into, I mean, he writes and passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Great Society, Medicare. All those programs come out of his administration. So I think that the greater
Yeah.
good, I think sometimes that they may start for other reasons, but the greater good may come from experience and.
And Lyndon Johnson's a good example. I'm not an expert on American history by any means, but I believe that when he signed the Civil Rights Act into being, he said, "We've lost the South now for generations to come." Is that correct?
No, I don't think so. No, no, he
Oh,
engineered a fairly strong Southern. He had well, it was obviously he had a strong Southern contingent. So did Nixon. That was Nixon's. The Southern Democrats were really behind Nixon also. Yeah.
oh,
So
I shall
no,
have to
listen, I
check
don't remember
my
that the
facts.
quote about we've lost the South for generations. I don't think that's. I don't remember that. Perhaps I don't recall that.
Although you do look at the South these days, and it does tend to be red rather than blue.
Yeah, yeah. But do you have to look at places like that, all that post-war Southern development that happened in Atlanta and North Carolina? Those places really came a long way rather quickly and have
Mm.
thrived in the last 40 years.
Can we move on to whether courage is actually desirable in politicians? Thinking back to that classic BBC comedy series in the 80s, Yes, Prime Minister, where if they want the minister not to do something, they say, very courageous minister, meaning he knows it's a really catastrophically bad idea. And of course, the trouble with courage is it does depend a lot on the perspective of the observer. So, like, if you sympathise with the prime minister or the president, you will probably admire their courage. Whereas if you're opposing them, then you'll probably think that they're being dogmatic or egotistical or belligerent, or the same actions can definitely be perceived in different ways depending on the perspective of the perceiver.
That's correct. Which team you're on?
Yes. But even, I mean, courage can imply. I suppose the question here is, how much do we want our politicians to do, like to change, to mix things up? And I think we want them to be morally courageous if we agree with their agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't agree with their agenda, then we'd quite like them to be a lot more timid.
Well, if you assume that the government, that democratic governments in general are designed to be fairly slow-moving, ponderous beasts, as they should be,
Yes.
it's the scary thing is when one goes rogue and decides they're going to make a lot of changes very quickly.
Oh,
That's
no names spring to mind at all.
Well, I think that's that. Yeah, well, that mind that this current administration seems to have a lot of changes they want to do, but they're not going to change that beast. That thing moves slowly, and as well
Even when you have both houses and the Supreme Court.
as well it should. It should be difficult to change the course of the government and not be capricious or able to do things quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
think that's a fair comment.
I think in that sense, then the amount of courage that any given politician brings to the table is sort of negated by the way the system works. In a way, they're not. They can have all the conviction and courage in the world, and have a lot of good intentions, but changing the way the government works or the way that things are done is a very difficult thing to do.
And somewhat related to that, one of my great frustrations with the systems of democracy that generally prevail in your country and mine is when it comes to very long term problems like climate change,
Mm.
where the payback is going to be so long term that it's not going to deliver any short term benefits in terms of popularity or winning the next election. And there's not that much incentive for politicians to really tackle that one. Certainly here with the mining industry, which by definition, as any extractive industry does, it has a finite lifetime. But it seems like it's easy to pass the buck forwards to the next president to just go, oh, well, not on my watch, not my problem. It's sort of like this musical chairs, rather than tackling these problems that are perceived as being, often with climate change, it's perceived that the measures needed involve some degree of sacrifice and certainly change, and people tend to be somewhat change resistant, especially when their jobs specifically are going to be affected. So I am wondering out loud about what system of governance, or at the moment it seems like if we'd wanted to come up with a political system almost guaranteed to trash the planet in terms of climate change, then short-term democracy is a pretty good way of going about it.
Yes, it's fairly hard to tackle a 100-year problem with a 2-year election cycle.
Exactly.
And that's the shortest. The longest is the 6 years for the senators. So it's difficult to keep a 100-year problem in mind if you've got a 6-year cycle.
And it's perceived as being it's perceived as being a vote loser rather than a vote winner.
Yes, it is.
Whether that perception is correct or not, that's sort of where we are.
But that's why you have systems that are also in place. No matter who comes and goes, that the people cycle in and out of the system in the House of Representatives or in the Parliament. They cycle in and out, but the bureaucracy is there to be a steady force moving forward, and that's where you point your. That's where the long-term change has to be affected. That's its goal and role, I think.
Although it doesn't seem to be working at the moment very effectively.
Oh, that's. I think that yeah, it all seems gloom and doom right now. But if you look at the long-term tax policies, and I mean, particularly look at Germany. Germany one day last summer, the entire country. It was on a Sunday evening, on a sunny Sunday evening, but the entire country ran for 2 hours on solar power.
Hmm.
You know, and Germany has, it is a plodding government, and it's not a fast moving government, but it is a steady moving government. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that is certainly inspiring to hear.
Yeah. And I think that you look at, if I think of politicians who show public courage, I mean, Angela Merkel's right at the very top.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
mean, she's so much smarter than those other people, but in spite of that, really gracious. I think
Mm.
that she is an unsung hero. She truly is.
Yeah, you don't hear her getting a lot of praise, but I've always been very impressed with her.
She's obviously a brilliant person,
Yeah.
and to hold on to power in that, the Germans are many things. But big on equality of the sexes, not so much.
Vic, I want to make sure we don't run out of time before we
Oh,
get to
oh,
the conspiracy theory of
yes,
the
but
week.
you know what? I think I was so busy putting on my pants, and the last three, literally the last 3 days here have absolutely been crazy. So I'm going to. We didn't talk about it. I'm going to have to pass on a conspiracy theory today. I don't have one really researched right now. It's
No
that
worries.
if there is conspiracy here, it is that events are conspiring to all come to a head here in about the next 2 weeks. That well, yeah, I've got. I go back to Germany and I do the big awards ceremony. That's on the
Yeah.
29th. And we suddenly got tons of orders for audio guiding, and I'm having to crank out those. I've been in the studio literally every hour since the last 3 days.
Wow.
Yeah, it was so
Busy
so
man.
so events are conspiring against me getting my conspiracy together.
That was very smooth, Vic. So in that case, I shall just say, folks, if you're listening to this on iTunes or otherwise audio only, do please check out the blog post. I'm going to be including a number of my slides that I think, I actually started feeling some sympathy for politicians when I did this particular slide of all the different interests that they have to try and balance. And it's pretty much a hiding to nothing. And I was trying to find this quote that I think Obama said that, politics gets a lot easier once you realise that whatever you do, you're going to upset somebody.
Yeah, yeah. I just finished a book about the interstate road system,
Oh,
which is
yes.
the biggest public works project of all ever. Yeah, building
Mm.
the interstate system, which was basically done in from 1958 till 1972. In about 14 years, the vast majority of it was built. A huge undertaking, and how the system evolved, and how the politicians involved in building those things had to suddenly take things into consideration, like the public's concerns and environmental concerns. And it went from being a
Mm.
very engineering driven project to one that suddenly had to be kind of a public relations project. And that has, another example of politics getting involved in
Yeah.
everyday life. They had to make a lot of changes in the system, because finally some cities like New Orleans said no, 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 no. You're not going to do this to this town, because the engineers just drew lines on maps. This is where these roads should go. And they published the book. It's called The Yellow Book. They published The Yellow Book in 1958. The members of Congress looked at it, went stamp, approved the money for it, and they just started building those roads with no consideration for what they were going to do to the cities.
Wow. And also, well, I'm thinking of it through the lens of like migratory wildlife, where you suddenly have this impassable or these barriers across the entire country.
Right. Right. You know, the Norwegians build, when they build a new highway here, they build wildlife overpasses.
Yeah. Why were they in such a hurry in the US in the 1950s why were they rushing this through so much?
Well, the way they sold it was a national defense project that they could use. They could use it to evacuate the cities quickly in case of a nuclear attack, and to move the defense the infrastructure around, to move all the trucks and things. The ironic thing is, they specified that the height of all the overpasses on the interstates would be 14 feet. When sadly, all of the missile-carrying trucks were 17 feet high.
Oh dear.
Yeah, they had to amend
Big
it.
oops.
Yeah. And you know, they used those, and I did a paper about this when I was in school. They used these as urban planning projects.
Mm-hmm.
And guess who got steered when they would steer those interstates into the cities? Guess who got kicked out? The poor, the disadvantaged,
of course.
the minorities, the first.
As always.
And they destroyed what essentially was the black middle class in the United States. There was a thriving black middle class in a lot of American cities, and when they brought the interstates through those towns, they just saw, because it was an opportunity to what the white communities looked on as sort of slums.
Yeah.
To just get rid of them. Anyway, I'm kind of. Oh, there's my conspiracy theory. It was.
Well, whether it was a conspiracy or whether it was just inadvertent or thoughtless,
right. That's right.
I suppose this is absolutely proving the point that no matter what a politician does, like trying to improve things in one area, there are always impacts.
There's always, you're always going to make somebody angry.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I still don't have much sympathy.
Who would be a politician?
But I still don't have a whole lot of sympathy for them. They know what they're getting into. If you are in a position to be elected to Congress, right, in the United States, you have played the game. You have worked your way up from city council to county commissioner to blah, 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 blah.
Yes.
And
you're not that naive.
No. Oh, that's the other thing. My grandfather was a county commissioner in Iowa.
But hang on, Vic. Sorry, in connection with that last one, but you can go straight in as president of the US without having worked your way up through anything.
That's an exception, I'd say.
Great. Okay. Vic, I must go. I have a meeting with one of my lovely students this morning and another one this afternoon, and a bunch of other things going on today at Yale, where there is always so much going on, and it seems to be only accelerating as we get into the last couple of weeks of the semester. The end is coming up very fast.
Cool.
And as most of my class are seniors, they are soon going to be launching themselves into an unsuspecting world.
Oh, they're probably all going to take the MCATs or the LSATs or the graduate school tests. They're all going on to master's
Actually,
level.
Yeah, but a lot of them are going to take some time out first. Okay, so they're launching themselves and then de-launching themselves. Anyway, either way, I don't want to be late for my meeting.
No, don't do that. Okay.
Well, good luck, Vic. Don't work too hard. Thank you, lovely listeners, and we will be here again same time next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.